So we have with us today Zach Miller, who's a neurologist and neurobehaviorist at University of California, San Francisco. And I was lucky enough to strike up a friendship with Zach when I did my fellowship. So I'm blessed to have him come talk to us, because what he's doing, he specializes in rare dementias, and PCA is a disease that he works with. And some of you have actually been to him. And so, Zach, take it away, Dr. Miller.
Okay. Well, I didn't know that anyone on this call has been a patient of mine. So if that is the case, I hope you enjoyed the work that you've already contributed to. So this is a project that I argue I've been working on for the past 10 years, that it's taken a decade of my life to do, and I only got here 10 years ago. So it's the first things I got interested in. I came to the Memory and Aging Center for a particular reason, to study new onset artistic creativity, and in the process of looking through the literature on that, found that people that exhibited a particular kind of artistic expression happened to be awfully left-handed. And I'm awfully left-handed. So the title of this talk, a two-hit hypothesis for neurodegenerative disease, how neurodevelopmental differences and environmental insults inversely correlate with age of onset in Alzheimer's disease. This is a talk that I gave to the Alzheimer's Association International Conference this summer. So you guys are getting the full science. I'm happy to unpack it. But I think it was pretty well received for that audience. I hope it's well received here. But so when I say no formal disclosures, I have informal disclosures. I'm left-handed. I used to have red hair when I had hair, and very likely dyslexic, self-diagnosed. Suffered from seizures when I was a child. So there's all sorts of things that make us who we are. And these are some of the things that I think are important to kind of who I am. So in 2009, I came specifically to the Memory and Aging Center, basically to worship in Bruce Miller's temple. The group that he created here was sort of my first choice. I never had gotten into a first choice college or med school. I love where I went to college. I loved where I went to med school. But this is where I got my first choice, when I absolutely said, Dr. Miller, I want to come to the Memory and Aging Center and learn everything I can about this phenomena of new onset artistic creativity. He had first described this in this case, this is an individual's artistic production in an article he had written in 2004. And can you see my pen pointer highlighter? So I'm just circling Dr. Bruce Miller's face here. Yes. I always have to make the informal disclosure that there's no relation, except when he's really happy with me, and then he'll introduce me as his son. So in 2009, I came here to study these individuals that exhibited this incredible phenomenon in the setting of neurodegenerative disease, in the setting of progressive language deterioration, developed passions, new onset abilities in the visual arts. And so when I was looking at the literature of this, in 12 cases that were described, about a third were what we call non-right-handed. So that means they were not right-handed. So if you're left-handed, if you're ambidextrous, or if you were forced to be right-handed, you're one of us. So I consider, I see somebody waving their hands, excellent. And so I like you guys better already than everybody else. So I share my biases openly. So I looked into this and wondered, could something about hand preference be related to specific disorders, and discovered that sure enough, in this group of individuals who had more of this new onset artistic ability, it turns out even when we looked at people who weren't in this rarefied group of new onset artistic individuals, but just the whole group itself, they were about twice as non-right-handed, about twice as left-handed as the general population. And that basically is my whole career. Everything starts from this finding, and everything that you're going to see starts from this sort of kernel. And that's because the father of behavioral neurology, this individual, Norman Geschwind, had his latest, greatest, and most infamous hypothesis. He died early. I think it was a heart attack. I don't know. He died at like the prime of his career. It was devastating. But he is the fundamental kind of driver of behavioral neurology, of looking at particular regional anatomies and ascribing various different functional components to them, a titan in the field. And the last sort of hypothesis that he put out there was made fun of, derided. People said, man, this guy, what happened to him? He was our Einstein, and how he's fallen. And what he had described was that people who were not right-handed, for instance, seemed like there was associations between things like non-right-handedness, musical and artistic giftedness, things like learning disabilities, dyslexia, stuttering, immune diseases, allergies, asthma, autoimmune disease, seizures, migraine headaches, a whole slew of these kinds of behavioral and health differences that were unified essentially by non-right-handedness. And this was called the Geschwind-Behan-Galiberta hypothesis. So with, this finding of more non-right-handedness in mind, in a group of people that were seemingly kind of new onset artistic gifted, I just sort of wondered, what if we invoked this hypothesis, if we assumed that it was true, could we study, these other features and either prove, or frankly, I'd be happy enough if we disproved his theory, if we fundamentally said, you know what, he was absolutely wrong. Turns out he was absolutely right, but that maybe is giving away the punchline. But so I wanted to investigate the relationships between things like non-right-handedness and autoimmunity. I wanted to look at non-right-handedness and learning disability, and I wanted to see the interrelationships of all of these findings. And in this group of rare language patients, we just didn't have enough numbers to see how things related to each other. And so I decided to expand my collection to the most common neurodegenerative disease. Instead of the rare diseases, I'm going to go for the most common and look at all of these Geschwind factors in folks with Alzheimer's disease. And the reason that, I thought that was so important is, don't know if you guys are familiar with Brad Dickerson, David Wolk, folks that are sort of our colleagues and the like, and very friendly researchers, do great work. They had this nice quote in a paper of theirs in 2010, so almost 10 years ago. It said, despite its potential importance for diagnosis, intervention, disease monitoring, and ultimately our understanding of disease pathophysiology, there are surprisingly few data regarding the potential genetic or environmental factors that underlie clinical or pathologic heterogeneity of AD. And that's because not all AD is AD. And you guys know this better than everybody else, that when people outside think of something like Alzheimer's disease, they think of something that's late onset, they think of something that's memory predominant. But we study the unusual cases, the early onsets, the non-amnestic forms. And so trying to figure out, why would a disorder have a typical or atypical form? Why would a disorder attack the left side or the right side, or the younger age or an older age? And so that's essentially what we set out to try and figure out and determine. Could there be demographic differences? And so this is just a kind of a flow chart describing in detail this collection. One of the reasons it took 10 years to do is because this is almost an insane person's kind of endeavor. I mean, the amount of work here, I had to ultimately, I screened, I collected and read through 1,500 individual notes, persons that came to the Memory and Aging Center. And so this is my plea, that when you show up here, if you've ever been a part of our research and ever wondered, did I matter? Did that visit matter? It does to me. Everybody counts. It's a census, sort of U.S. Census cry. But if you show up here and you get a note written, and I have access to it, for instance, it counts for me because I'm arguably a glorified bean counter in this case. So looked at ultimately 750 early onset Alzheimer's disease cases, arguably the world's largest collection. I think that is a little bit of a happenstance. Dr. Bruce Miller is the world's leader in behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, not Alzheimer's disease, but every time somebody comes to the Memory and Aging Center, it's because a physician said, I don't know what this is. And so sometimes they come here and we say, this is behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia, but more than half the time we say, this is early onset AD, and you don't know what this is because you're used to just sort of understanding late onset. So it's a sort of a little unknown secret that the World Center for Frontotemporal Dementia is also the world center, arguably, for early onset non-memory forms of Alzheimer's disease. So, and we use the sort of, I would say, classic definition, what is the most consensus upon definition for what early onset Alzheimer's means, which is if your symptoms were before age 65, then you're considered early onset. After age 65, you would be considered late onset. And I think this is nonsense, but you'll see why later on. Also, the data that I had, we tried to, we'd say, validate the findings. So is there reason to believe, even in this heroically large group, can we get even more evidence or proof to suggest the findings that I see here might be relevant to other people, other countries, other centers, and the like. So there's a program that the government funds through the NIH, the National Alzheimer Coordinating Centers. So if you haven't come to the Memory and Aging Center, but you have come to any other university centers on Alzheimer's disease, it's very likely that, guess what, you also count for my purposes. That I may have counted you through this outside group. And we also happen to have international collaborators who helped us out and got us a modest size collection, but you'll see later on a very important collection because they were able to capture aspects of patients, participants' background that the NAC didn't account for. And so we have this little flow chart here where we started with 80,000 people. And this was, easier to filter. I just had to click on an Excel spreadsheet and remove people who didn't meet the appropriate diagnoses of things like Alzheimer's disease, or if we found that folks had genetic causes associated with their disorder. I was looking to study individuals that had the physician, the clinician felt were Alzheimer's disease of an idiopathic or a non-genetic form, so that we could study these environmental or epidemiological factors. And we ended up with almost 10,000 AD cases in total, 1,500 from me, and about 9,000 from these outside sources, so over 10,000, I should say. And sort of punchline now, we're getting to the real data, looking at things that are considered typical risk factors. So you probably have heard some of this stuff before, but that vascular disease is associated with typical late onset Alzheimer's disease. And some of the things they mean by that are hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes. And it turns out that they're overrepresented in late onset Alzheimer's disease individuals. It's a little bit of an obvious finding because these things are overrepresented in anyone who is over age 65. So you would expect that as you get older, these things are overrepresented. But looking at our group, our early onset group at the MAC, our late onset group, our validation cohort, we were able to see that hypertension, hyperlipidemia, diabetes were very much overrepresented in the older group than the younger group. But then there were also some things that were importantly not different in our group they happen to be different in the validation group, but in our group, the amount of ApoE4 alleles. ApoE4 is the greatest genetic risk factor that's not an autosomal dominant gene. It's a risk gene that appears to have the greatest impact on risk of something like Alzheimer's disease. And there's some reason to believe that it's overrepresented in late onset groups. In our numbers, it was actually no different. In this larger NAC data set, it was sort of in the opposite direction. They were finding more ApoE4 in younger folks. Education in our data was no different between our two groups. In this case, it was a lower education in the late onset group. People have seen that things like greater amount of education may be protective, and so that may be what we're seeing in the NAC group. But in the Memory and Aging Center, we get very highly educated people. And so all of our cohorts, all of our individuals that show up here oftentimes have many, many years of education. And we saw no sex differences between our early onset and late onset group. But in this case, it looked like there were maybe fewer males in the late onset group. And this is something that has been seen, that for the most part, I think it is fair to call Alzheimer's disease sexist. It affects women more so than men. And that's a fascinating topic of inquiry that I'm always interested in. And our study doesn't have too much to say on that, but maybe some interesting hints there. But when we look at, let's see, trying to go to my next slide. Oh, I guess I've got the pinwheel of death here. So hopefully it'll catch up. I don't know if you can see the pinwheel happening on your screen. Okay, let's cross our fingers. I guess this would be a great time to answer any questions that people have. The technical difficulties are coming back. Anybody have particular questions? Yeah.
Do you want to take some questions? If you do, just raise your hand and I'll just unmute you here. Okay, go ahead, Eleanor. Wait, I can't unmute you for some reason. There it goes.
So that was just a false lure, just teasing you. Although, since we did offer it, if anybody has any burning questions, I'd love to.
We'll take the questions after, Eleanor. You'll just.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, write them down, and so because I don't want you to forget if you had something that you wanted to talk about. So now we get to the things that I was really interested in, these novel factors, and I'm making sure not to call them risk factors here. The vascular disease, those are clear risk factors. These are, it's unclear. This work is pretty pioneering and new, and so maybe they're risk factors, but right now they're just factors. I don't know what exactly we're seeing other than we're seeing differences. And in this case, if we look at hand preference, we see that in the early onset group, in our group, it's almost 16% versus 8%. It's almost twice the amount of non-right-handedness. And when we look at this group of much, much larger Alzheimer's disease cohort from the National Alzheimer Coordinating Center and the Amsterdam University Medical Center, they also see it's less dramatic, but they also see that there's more non-right-handedness in this earlier onset group than a late onset group. Since I had shown this data, people, have thought this was compelling enough, but very recently, I think maybe a month ago now, a paper had come out on observing some new genetics associated with non-right-handedness. And the punchline is they found an association between things like the genes related to non-right-handedness and Alzheimer's disease. So amazing validation of our findings. From that paper, it's unclear if the non-right-handedness is a risk factor, meaning more likely to get Alzheimer's, or protective? In my sort of findings, it splits both ways. It suggests that while being left-handed is overrepresented in the early onset group, it may actually be underrepresented in the late onset group. So as a southpaw, a lefty myself, if I make it past 65, I'm going to be less likely to get Alzheimer's disease. The question is, will I make it past 65? And so it's a kind of a nuanced finding there. Learning disability, we weren't able to validate the learning disability aspect of our study because the NAC database just doesn't collect that information. But we found profoundly much higher rates of learning disability, as noted in the chart histories, in our early onset group than our late onset group. Seizure history, in this case we broke the history of seizures into two types, something defined as remote seizure and something defined as active seizure. And remote seizure would be if somebody had a seizure, many years before their first cognitive symptoms. An active seizure is if they continue to have seizure concerns or new onset seizure concerns in the setting of their disease. And so that distinction was created because the NAC provides those two differences, and arguably remote seizures might point to some neurodevelopmental difference, whereas active seizures might reflect a slightly different sort of underlying kind of pathophysiological process, maybe one related to the disease process itself. Either way, the early onset group in both our data set and the validation data set had much more prevalence of seizure than the late onset groups. And then the last kind of health diagnostic demographic I was looking at, autoimmune disease. Again, the validation data set, the NAC didn't collect that kind of information, but we saw that there were statistically more autoimmune diseases in the younger group than the later group. And so we continued to investigate this data, and again, looks like my computer is acting up. Yeah, now we're back again. Another thing that we looked at is within this group, what were the percentages of individuals that had a non-memory form of Alzheimer's disease? So the phenotype, what percentage had something like a visual variant of Alzheimer's disease, also known as posterior cortical atrophy, something that was described by a gentleman named Frank Benson. Frank Benson's teacher was Norman Geschwind, who I introduced you to, and Frank Benson's student was Bruce Miller, making me essentially the great godson, I guess, or I don't know what. I'm in the family tree somehow, but great grandson of Norman Geschwind, and we happen to have a Geschwind here, so I'm even more connected. So we looked at these non-amnestic cases, and this is not surprising. This is not new. But in our early onset collection, roughly a quarter, roughly 25% are non-memory form versus only about 10% in our late onset group. Here is a failing, in my mind, of the NAC, and one of the reasons why I needed to get the AUMC group. The NAC, in terms of how they capture folks, they only were showing about 4% of their group had these non-memory forms, and in their late onset group, less than 1%. Some of that is because most groups are used to identifying the memory forms and don't always know what to make of the non-memory forms. Whereas I offered before, we've always been a group that has embraced non-memory forms of cognitive challenges, starting off with things like behavioral variant frontotemporal dementias and the fact that some other frontotemporal dementias are language-based, we've always stressed, well, what about all the other cognitive domains? What about behavior? What about visual, spatial, executive, language, motor? So, again, we had a leg up in this, but the differences still were ringing true, that earlier onset Alzheimer's disease is much more enriched in non-memory forms. And a little bit of a caveat, there are many, there's a heterogeneity of the non-memory forms. I restricted my analysis to the logopenic, the language forms, and the posterior cortical atrophy, the visual spatial forms. And that's because some of the motor forms, something called cortical basal syndrome, it's not always so clear when somebody is given that clinical diagnosis, will they have underlying Alzheimer's disease pathology? Sometimes they have something called a sole tauopathy. Alzheimer's disease is considered a secondary tauopathy. Tau is a very important part of Alzheimer's disease, but they also have the presence of something called beta amyloid. Our history with logopenic variant primary progressive aphasia, that was a condition that was basically found here under one of my other mentors, Dr. Gorno Tempini, and I think that was in 2004. So that's one where if you're given this language diagnosis, it's very high, almost 100% in our non-genetic cases will have underlying Alzheimer's disease, and likewise posterior cortical atrophy. If you're given this diagnosis and there is no known underlying genetic cause, it's very, very likely, almost 100%, that the underlying pathology is Alzheimer's disease. Now, none of these are 100%. There are plenty of cases, rare kinds of exceptions to this rule, but we restricted it to this group. And because we saw that the non-amnestic group was overrepresented in our early onset versus our late, and we were finding other demographic features that were overrepresented in the early and the late, I wanted to make sure these findings weren't driven by the non-amnestic group. So if we looked at essentially amnestic early onset AD versus amnestic late onset AD, did these differences survive? And lo and behold, all of them survived. The vascular risk factors were higher in the older population, and these novel risk factors, or that I sort of would colloquially call Geschwin's factors, were all overrepresented in the earlier group than the later group. So it wasn't driven or solely because of an enriched amount of non-amnestic AD in that group. We're back, maybe. Again, if you have a question, maybe now's a good time. And by the time you ask it, it'll probably be back up and running.
Okay, Eleanor, you can unmute yourself because I'm having problems unmuting you.
Okay.
Did you have something that you
Well,
wanted?
I wanted to hear more about what amnestic means. I didn't understand that
Oh,
word.
not non-memory. Amnestic is memory. Amnestic is memory, and non-amnestic is non-memory problems. Like you guys don't have, you have posterior cortical atrophy. Your memories are fine now.
Well, not true, but not in Eleanor's case.
Right, right.
Pressed to the frontal.
Well, that's true, and actually, Dr. Miller, Eleanor was one of the patients who actually came for a second opinion with you, and they were very, very happy that they landed in your lap. So.
Wonderful. Well, I can offer you the easy definition is amnesia, right? We all know what amnesia is, and so amnestic refers to memory. Non-amnestic, again, refers to non-memory, and it's defined that way because in Alzheimer's disease, memory is the sort of loudest. It's the trumpet of the group. It's the loudest note, and non-amnestic cases, of course, have memory affected eventually, and vice versa. We know that all the memory predominant forms of Alzheimer's disease, as they progress, will affect language, will affect the visual spatial. So it's really an issue of, they're kind of on a spectrum, and it's an issue of where it starts and where it evolves. And so non-amnestic Alzheimer cases will eventually become amnestic, and all amnestic Alzheimer cases will eventually develop the features of non-amnestic. We call it a sort of when conditions generalize or become more global. But in this case, we were looking at how the memory early onset AD and the memory late onset AD, the differences we had seen had still survived. Now I wanted to say, well, what did the non-amnestic AD look like? Basically, what did the group of logopenic and PCA cases look like? And in this case, they had some of the highest rates of things like learning disability. They had some of the highest rates of autoimmune disease. They had high rates of all the novel factors. What was particularly exciting to me, though, is they had low rates of the ApoE4 gene. They had rates of the ApoE4 gene that were at the same level as the general population, and our amnestic early onset AD and amnestic late onset AD, they were now identical in their percentage of ApoE4 and at elevated rates in the general population. So people have touched on this before. They've called these non-amnestic AD as E4 negative cases of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, and the greatest risk factor has been this ApoE4 allele and these vascular risk factors, and that's where everybody is paying all this attention to. And I say, well, nonsense. You're not paying attention to my constituents because they don't have those risk factors. And here are a whole bunch of novel factors that if we unpack, could this help us understand? Could it help us understand why you got this condition? How many physicians have been able to answer the reason of why? We're not very good at that when it comes to neurodegenerative disease. And perhaps by the end of this slideshow, you'll start to wonder, are we getting closer? Let me see if there's a way to... maybe if we even just try to... Let's see, I don't have much else open. So I closed a couple of things. Hopefully that makes it easier.
Nice.
We'll see. Fingers crossed. So we're right here.
Right.
So we looked at this, and the way we did the statistical comparisons for those who are sort of mathematically minded was very simple in those prior analyses, just looking at group A, group B. We decided to put them into a mathematical model that tries to account for other demographic features, and everything basically remained and survived. So controlling for is somebody male or female or years of education, it didn't matter. These findings are so powerful, there was nothing that was able to knock them out of significance. And then we started to look at, well, we have more than 10,000 cases of Alzheimer's disease that we're looking for. We've identified these sort of typical factors and novel factors. What if instead of looking at, splitting the group up by this arbitrary age cutoff, 65 and older. What does that mean? You know, some people who are 65 act like they're 55 or act like they're 75. That age biologically is different, arguably, than chronologically. I'm not sure how old I am right now. I think I'm aging. I think I'm a lot older biologically, sadly, than I am chronologically, because I've been working on this grant furiously for the past month. So if we got rid of that definition and we just looked at the distribution of where the typical factors are, you can see why they were overrepresented in an older group, in the group 65 and older, than younger. But we see that the mean age, folks, the point where the typical factors reach sort of the apex, that average age on. When we look at the novel factors, it's less dramatic a hill. It's more of a hill than a mountain. But we see that the novel factors, the mean age for that group was 67. And if we tried to look at what age, we chose this cutoff of 65 based on medical literature and looking into the literature of that cutoff. It is quite arbitrary. It's basically defined by issues of retirement age, Social Security and the like. So that's why everybody knows 65. But when you get rid of that cutoff and you look at what is the mean of these two means, it turns out that something like 69.2 in this data set would more optimally split those differences between the typical and novel factors. And so with this, I'm arguing that should the field, I'm hoping to submit this paper soon, and after this paper gets published, would people take this on and say, could we provide a data-driven definition of what it means to have early onset or late onset Alzheimer's disease? And I believe that this is fundamental, incredibly important, and it seems trivial. It absolutely seems trivial. Oh, who cares? 65, 70. What would be the impact of that? Alzheimer's disease, the prevalence, the amount of cases doubles every 5 years after age 65. And so if we were to take this, what I'm arguing is a rational, data-driven approach to define early onset as now less than age 70 instead of less than age 65. The day somebody believes that, other than me, we triple the number of early onset cases in the world. And again, this is incredibly important to me because PCA, logopenic, I get on my soapbox all the time. These are unloved, underfunded, underappreciated disorders that need the attention that things like late onset Alzheimer's disease gets. And so tripling this population would mean outrage and an outcry of, you need to put research efforts and funding into us. We matter too. And beyond that, which would be incredible if this is the case, but what if there are drugs that actually work in Alzheimer's disease but failed because of this age cutoff? So I believe, a lot of us here believe, that there may be differences. They may be subtle or they may be very important in the underlying pathophysiological process between early onset cases and late onset cases. So is it possible that people could go back to their studies and employ this cutoff and find new results? And might we find that there is a drug that works in early onset AD or works in late onset AD? I mean, it's unlikely, but it's a possibility. And so that, the argument is if there are pathophysiological differences, we need a divide that reflects that, not an arbitrary divide. That's going to make it very hard for us to move forward any novel treatments. Then another question that I was super excited to look into. So we told you that ApoE4 is a huge, huge important risk factor in late onset AD, but it's not so important, at least seemingly, in the groups of patients that I'm really interested in. So restricting our analyses now just to people who had ApoE4 results. So we're throwing out a lot of people here, and now dividing our cohorts into those who were negative for a particular gene or positive, and then dividing them into these sort of non-amnestic versus the early onset and late onset cases. We basically found something I thought was super exciting, that in the non-memory forms, the things like logopenic or PCA, there were no differences between the age that was predicted for the early, the novel risk factors or the typical risk factors, so that E4 was not playing a role, was not affecting when your disease was how and when it manifested. But in the memory forms, people with an E4 allele, it's additive. It was synergistic. That if you were left-handed and you had an E4, you were younger than if you were left-handed and you didn't have an E4. So it suggests that these factors, these novel factors, are themselves independent risk factors for an Alzheimer process that may interact with E4. E4 is basically a risk factor for something called the hippocampus. That's the memory center of the brain. And so the novel factors that I have, they make a difference on hippocampal disease, but they also are reflecting a difference perhaps in diseases that affect what we call the parietal lobes, the sort of back of your head. The left parietal lobe is especially important for language, and the right parietal lobe is for facial. It's presumably or arguably the center of where things like PCA start. And going further, dividing up this or dissolving this early onset, late onset distinction, we had such a large, basically treat age as a continuous variable, dissolve this, and start looking at the essentially how frequent any of these learning differences or novel factors were across this entire age range. There we go. So splitting this group up now into one group each that's on the of this age, very young and sort of very old, and then one group each that's directly in the middle. In this case, each one of these diamonds reflects 300 people of this 1,500 cohort.
Are you talking, Zach? Because we can't hear you now.
No, it's I have the frozen screen again.
Okay, while Zach is getting that, any questions? You want to raise your hand and I'll take a question until he gets it up. Yes, George.
Just a curiosity question on the novel factors. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yep. Yeah.
All right.
I can hear you.
Yeah, on the novel factors, for example, you mentioned the non-right-handedness, sort of the cutoff was somewhere between the 15% and the 8%, because you said actually you have a lower than average chance if you are late onset, I think you said. I was just curious if there is information about what for all of those novel factors, kind of what the general population percentage is.
Yeah, I bet left-handedness is 10%. It's thought 8 to 10%, and so in which case, you know, factors, that's a little bit harder to provide a good number, and so what is this visualization. So here we are, we're splitting up this group, and now we can map each of the MAC 300 groups, the first quintile, the second quintile, so on and so forth, and we can do the same thing with those near 9,000 validation group, and we can see how hypertension changes the percent in our group over age. And there are, it was hard to find, but there are age defined percentages of things like hypertension in the general population. And so for all the typical factors, what we found is that a lot of them had this sort of up and down, we could say quadratic functions, that they fit things that look like parabolas or curves, such that they were not particularly overrepresented in the youngest group. They were highest in this sort of more middle-aged and an older group, but then they started to dip again as people became sort of the oldest old. And so this is something that folks, I think UC Irvine, Claudia Kawas, is particularly interested in this group that they call the oldest old. And so this is fascinating sort of demographic data that hopefully will inform a lot of typical Alzheimer research. Another fascinating parallel is things like ApoE4 and the cholesterol measures. They're almost identical in their appearance. And we know that ApoE4 plays a role in cholesterol metabolism. So that was super interesting. But then our novel factors all show this inverse relationship. So it's not just an issue of the fact that you had more in the early onset or in the late onset. I would argue whatever age you are less left-handed the older you are, for instance. And so this is where if you take a look at the 10%, the line crosses over so that there's more Alzheimer's disease cases, there's more non-right-handedness in the younger group and potentially less in the older group. Learning disability, we think, we believe that dyslexia occurs at about 10% of the general population, and that is the most common learning disability. But as to what a percentage is for all learning disabilities, I don't have a good number for that. But maybe a similar sort of issue where there's a crossover where the earliest onset cases have more an enrichment of learning disability, and maybe later onset are sort of deficient. Seizures, the remote and active, I didn't have a great number of what the percentage of seizures are in the general population, but should be able to find that. Autoimmunity was even harder. That one is something that, this is neurology work here. This is another field, rheumatology and immunology. So that's even a little bit harder for me to come up with, what is a responsible general population estimate. I've heard things like, 10%, 8%, but mine includes things like thyroid disease, and so some of it is definitional, and it's something I'm still kind of wrestling with. But what we were able to do is, with this large enough collection, study the interrelationships between these factors, and performing something called a principal component analysis, a PCA, so posterior cortical atrophy and principal component analysis. It showed that people who were not right-handed had more language learning disabilities, for instance. This was, Geschwin's theory was that these things were all connected. But in our data, we found that left-handedness or non-right-handedness and learning disability were connected, but they were not related, in this case, to seizures and autoimmune disease. And so we called one of these components, the first component, the sort of developmental component, and the other component, the environmental component. And so I'm arguing these are the two hits. This is the title of my talk, a two-hit hypothesis, that basically how you're built and the life you live may hold unique kind of predict where you might be vulnerable to getting something like Alzheimer's disease, or in fact just neurodegenerative disease in general. Now, the autoimmune stuff is, all of these findings we can dig so much deeper into. And so this is just an example of those autoimmune dots, those little connections and bean counts. Well, I wanted to go in much greater depth because I told you, what it meant for me in terms of my collection is I had things like thyroid disease and more general autoimmune diseases, but I also had some very rare autoimmune diseases. You're not going to be able to read this, and nor are you this color. What I did is I had 1,500 of our cases where our notes on average are like 13 pages long. So we have such rich data to go through that we don't have when it comes to something like an ACT database. And coded the sort of amount or enrichment of these autoimmune diseases compared to the general population. So the rheumatologists and the like epidemiologists have ideas of how many people in the general population per 100,000 should develop something like psoriasis. And so I color-coded this to any box that's red here is the autoimmune disease occurring in this group of 1,500 was 20 times or greater than you might expect in the general population. Wow. This orange group, 10 times or greater. This sort of gold group, 5 times or greater. This banana-colored group, 3 times or greater. This green group, just about the right amount, 1 to 2 times. This blue color is actually happening less in our collection than people estimated in the general population. And then gray, it just didn't show up in our group. And I highlighted red here, a red box. This is our total group, this column here. This is all 1,500 individuals. But then I had made this impassioned argument before that I wanted to know who were the non-amnestic and what about the early onset cases that were without those non-amnestic, the memory early onset and the memory late onset. And I don't know if you can appreciate that there's a gradient where the non-amnestic, which includes the posterior cortical atrophy, the logopenic variant, they're on fire. The early onset are also inflamed, but maybe less so, and the late onset have the least amount of this. So it's mostly just a kind of a visual, kind of a heat map. And then whether or not you believe this, because frankly, folks here thought, gee, that's interesting, but prove it to me. And I said, isn't this enough? And they said, of course not. We need you to get an external validation cohort. I almost lost it because it's so hard to get this data. How was I going to do this? Well, I mentioned that I had some collections from Amsterdam, and I had another collection from the Mayo Clinic in Jackson. Other people have either come to the Memory and Aging Center and studied with us or have researched with us. I asked them at a much smaller scale autoimmune disease, and when they separated them into the non-amnestic versus the early onset memory and late onset memory, the pattern of overrepresented autoimmune diseases, I argue, is identical. This color bar and listing, this essential rank order, is locked into the Memory and Aging Center's rank. This group, this sort of validation group, the only autoimmune disease that's showing up at a high amount that wasn't at a high amount in ours was because we didn't even see it. So the general gradients are identical. And that if you start honing in on what are these autoimmune diseases that validated in both groups, they were more than 5 times greater. You start to see that something like psoriasis, for instance, it occurs about 10 to 20 times more often in our Alzheimer's disease group, especially in our early onset group. And so it's a common autoimmune disease that's uncommonly overrepresented. All the rest of these autoimmune diseases are exceptionally uncommon, and yet they also validate. So is there something that this tells us about Alzheimer's disease? Could we figure out something new about the underlying pathology? Well, it turns out that if you just looked up some of these autoimmune diseases on Google, which I did, and it spits out that I found this table in a review in Nature that there are particular autoimmune diseases that are unified by having a genetic change in something called the Fc gamma receptor. And basically all of the autoimmune diseases that are known to have this change are the ones that are showing up in our collection. And this thing, the Fc gamma receptor, is fascinating. It's the nexus between what we call the adaptive and the innate immune systems. So it's an incredibly important change that happens that presumably makes somebody just more likely to get something like autoimmune disease. And if you knock out that receptor in a mouse that has in an Alzheimer's disease model in mice, you knock out that receptor and it basically cures them or restores them. The Alzheimer's disease no longer develops in them. In psoriasis, there are well appreciated inflammatory signaling cascades, something called IL-17, IL-12/23. And different mouse studies and human studies had shown in Alzheimer's cases they have elevations of this signaling cascade, and that in mice, if you treated that signaling cascade, it also helped to kind of ameliorate or cure their Alzheimer's disease. And then last summer at the AAIC, somebody had looked at a genetic analysis of Alzheimer's disease and identified 2 new risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, both of which I just predicted. So I didn't know about their work. I've been working on this for 10 years. And so they saw an Fc gamma receptor polymorphism overrepresented in Alzheimer's, and they saw a polymorphism in the IL-17 signaling cascade. So all of a sudden, all of this starts to mean, could there be significance to these factors that we're describing? This is getting towards the tail end of the talk, that we have this idea of this 2-hit hypothesis that these developmental factors, these environmental factors matter. This here is something called a survival curve. It's used oftentimes in clinical trials to try and understand how good a drug works. Is there a difference in the slope of this particular curve? And so here at percent asymptomatic at the top, 100% of the people in our study were asymptomatic. At the bottom, now everybody is symptomatic. And on the x-axis is the age at which they became symptomatic. So every step represents a person, or sometimes many, many people. And so this is the average sort of decline in the folks, the amount of people who are developing Alzheimer's at each age range who had none of these novel risk factors. Now, if we look at the people who had one or the other, in this case they had seizure or they were non-right-handed, they were essentially younger at every age range, at every respective range. Having one of these factors meant that you were basically 3 years younger than if you didn't. And I should say that I chose seizure or non-right-handedness because those were the only factors I studied that were also validated, collected in the NAC database, and this reflects all 10,000 plus individuals we were looking at. But here's the kicker. When somebody had a history of seizure and they were non-right-handed, they were 12 years younger, basically. And I offered in my informal disclosures, I had a history of seizures and I'm non-right-handed, so I have a lot of interest in making sure that we get to the bottom of this as soon as possible. But the average age of the people without any risk factors was 71. The average age of somebody who had only one was 68. And the average age of people who had both was 59. This is an amazing figure. I have to thank the statistician I was working on for coming up with this sort of analysis visualization tool to show this, because I think this speaks very powerfully that these factors need to be appreciated and respected by the academic community at large. And so my hope is that the NAC and other groups will start collecting all of these risk factors that you guys will demand. Hey, you need to know about me and my personal life story, because it may matter to why I got this disease. And going further, what's behind this? Of course, I have ideas. And so this idea of the two-hit hypothesis, it turns out that when I looked at what was driving this, it was really the PCA cohort that had above and beyond the highest amount of all of these factors. In 1998, a brilliant neuroscientist, Carla Schatz, who's at Stanford, jokingly our rival here at UCSF, so rare for me to be promoting Stanford, but they do great work. Carla Schatz had shown that before its properties in the immune system, some of these genes, one of the most famous genes in the immune system, first plays a role in the neurodevelopment of the visual systems. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. I find that PCA have more autoimmune disease, so they maybe have changes in their immune system genes, but I also find that they have some of the highest amounts of types of learning disabilities. I found in a prior publication that there were more visual, spatial, or mathematical learning differences, something we call dyscalculia. I find that a lot of my PCA patients endorse never being great at things like geometry. Loved reading, hated geometry. I'm the opposite. I'm you get self-diagnosed dyslexic. I always hated reading, loved geometry. And then, so I wondered, could this sort of particular example that that Carla Schatz had shown, could this example be related to, could this reflect a generalizable feature? Might there be other genes that have this sort of dual action that play a role in immune system and in neurodevelopment? And it turns out that in one of the most rare autoimmune diseases that I had found, polymorphisms in this gene called semaphorin are related to this autoimmune disease. And I was scratching my head and I said, I know that name. And the reason I knew that name is because in 2016, in a genetic-wide screen of posterior cortical atrophy individuals, they identified a semaphorin gene as a risk factor for posterior cortical atrophy. And the semaphorins, you can look it up on Wikipedia. They say they are known for playing two roles, first in neurodevelopment and second in immune system signaling. And it turns out all the major genes I've been looking at do the same thing. The Fc gamma receptors, TREM2, which is now the second most famous Alzheimer's disease causing gene mutation, and ApoE itself. All of these genes that are kind of famous for playing a role in either the immune system or in Alzheimer's disease, they do dual billing. They play two roles. And so I'm arguing that we not only in the study identified that neurodevelopmental differences and environmental insults differ across AD presentations, early onset and non-amnestic, distinguish themselves from typical late onset amnestic Alzheimer's disease, but that we can reemploy these differences to produce this data-driven definition of early onset AD, that these novel risk factors, they act both independently and synergistically with this ApoE4 gene to produce Alzheimer's disease, that they possess linear inverse correlations with age at onset, such that there are differences between any two age range that you're studying, that they interrelate with each other in a manner that identifies entire new targets for prediction monitoring therapeutic intervention. In this case, the relationship between autoimmunity and seizure. I mean, what if all we need to do is identify somebody who's at risk based on their neurodevelopment of getting something like PCA and draw their blood and see if they have too much and treat them on an autoimmune drug, an anti-inflammatory drug? Would that lead to less hyperactivation, less seizure in the brain? There was also, I think, an article, maybe some of you saw, that was published in the newspapers that one of the pharma companies had done a study of their anti-rheumatoid arthritis drug, an anti-TNF alpha medication, a TNF alpha blocker, and found that it had benefits for Alzheimer's disease patients. So I think that hopefully we're going to start seeing trials that are based on inflammation, targeting inflammation as a means of treating Alzheimer's disease, and that these factors themselves, they demonstrate compounding effects on decreasing the age at onset of Alzheimer's disease. That how each of these factors has some sort of unique value in predicting disease that may ultimately understand an individual develop the disorder. And so with that, I'm essentially finished. I do have to offer that, this was not only 10 years of my life, but over 2 decades of efforts from center, but absolutely because of the efforts that all of our participants and their families had with
Awesome.
to destroy these disorders.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you so much. I just unmuted everybody. So if you have a question, we don't have much time because we have a support group following this, but I'm going to call on Eleanor and then other people.
Well, hi, this is Tom. I have a question that maybe either for Dr. Miller and for you, Jamie. Dr. Miller, you saw Eleanor in early 2017 to confirm the diagnosis that she got from Dr. Carolyn Fredericks at Stanford. And and then later on in the year, we moved to Florida. I took early retirement to be with Eleanor. And when we got here and looking for a neurologist or neuropsychologist, I contacted Mayo Clinic, and they said, "No, we can't, we don't take your insurance." Yeah. Now, given that, there are studies that you're doing, Stanford, and as a matter of fact, we were contacted a few months ago from Dr. Fredericks that, hey, we're doing a new PCA study. She didn't know we had moved to Florida. So there are these, like Mayo Clinic, you've cited them doing studies. I'm sure they're going to be doing other things. How does one, if you're not in their system, how does one get on a list that say, hey, we're doing a study and this person is in our system, but there's a list of PCA people and we'd like to how does one get into that loop?
Yeah, really.
It's a good question because, that when you're on our minds, we're able to kind of, reach out and say, oh, yeah, I would like to, this person would love to know more. I would say that, frankly, what Jamie's created, this support network for PCA is probably one of the best ways of people sort of knowing that you're out there, that you exist, and you want to be counted and you want to be involved. You personally, I would say, probably email me and let me know like what the problems are and say, Dr. Zach, can you, get somebody to get back to us, or because the personal connections oftentimes matter. And so, when I say that, we collaborate with Mayo Jacksonville, it's not exactly, I collaborate with one person, Neil Graff Radford, and he's sort of the Bruce Miller of that group. And so if I can get him on an email conversation with you guys, or whoever you talk to might say, oh yeah, we can't help you, but he might have ideas that would be beneficial. So I would say emailing your neurologist, if that's not helpful, emailing, Jamie, and Jamie can then get in touch with folks like me, or, that reaching out, letting people know that you want in on the action, or that you need assistance. There's a bunch of us that are really motivated to do whatever we can to help PCA, because, again, there are plenty of other disorders that have their kind of promoters and heroes and the like. PCA, logopenic variant, these non-amnestic Alzheimer's disease, I feel it's my responsibility to do anything I can do to help.
Thank you,
Thank
Dr.
you. It's most appreciated.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Because I know we got to get off soon. Support group. Yes,
I got
go ahead.
it has to do with novel factors. Is there, in your studies, any shown how they overlap? In other words, you mentioned something about the left hand and the seizures, but did you compile any data which shows that most people have more than one of those factors?
Yeah, in my studies, for instance, most people didn't have more than one of those factors. And again, only about 10% of the general population is left-handed, and only about 10% of the general population has something like dyslexia. And I don't know how many, what percentage have both, but it's less than that. And so when you add up all these factors, eventually it becomes relatively rare. But what we are able to then hopefully do is identify genes, like this group that identified this gene that's associated with left-handedness, because everything I'm measuring is arguably a kind of a superficiality of something that reflects a much greater underlying truth. And so I'm basically arguing that there's going to be discrete measurable factors, and whether or not it will come about from genetics or from some other direction, that would hopefully allow us to produce individual predictions of disease risk. I'm working with a gentleman, a brilliant neuroscientist, who has an ability to take a brain and age it or de-age it. So I don't know if you guys know of that Facebook kind of app that at one point you could take your picture and age you by 30 years or de-age you, that kind of thing. He's doing that with brains, and he's already looked at some of my demographic factors, and we found that it makes a difference. And so this grant that I'm writing right now to the government is to sort of argue that these novel factors are incredibly important to study, and that they may allow us to build a personalized disease algorithm, prediction algorithm, because it matters if you're left-handed or right-handed. Basically, everything matters. It matters if you have a learning disability or you don't. So my findings, they matter in both directions. And the thought is that we might be able to use that to predict at what age would somebody be at risk of the left parietal lobe or the right parietal lobe or the hippocampi. And the ultimate goal is could we ever reach a stage where we didn't actually have to cure this disease if we could just prevent it from happening in the first place?
Yeah.
That would be the end deliverable.
That would be amazing. And we could also use this group, Zach, because we have 300 members, and our individual support groups, we have 20 people. And we could do a study. We could do an observational study. We can do a developmental study. So just keep that in mind. And I know it's getting late. I'm going to take one more question from Kathy.
Oh, I think this lecture was absolutely outstanding, and I've learned so much about this PCA. But I'm wondering, taking it the next step, for the people who have the disease, is there any anti-inflammatory medication or any medication that is being seen to halt the progression of this disease? Have you seen anything in the studies that you've been equated with for this medication, for a medication at this time?
Yeah, so that's something that I've been kind of, on my soapbox, kind of yelling in the middle of essentially cornfields. There's nobody that's there to listen. But my hope is that the dedicated study of certain kinds of anti-inflammatory medicines would allow us to understand if this is beneficial. When people have studied things like ibuprofen or aspirin in folks who are currently symptomatic with typical Alzheimer's disease, they haven't found any disease modification properties. But my argument is that maybe that's not the group you want to study. Maybe it's that the PCA patients, maybe they're more prone to this inflammatory connection. So sadly, I don't have any direct recommendations, because we need to do careful study. And people who have looked at inflammation in humans and mice, it turns out it's not a bad word. There are times that it's beneficial, and there are other times where it's detrimental. And so the timing and the relationship matters. And so vitamin E is thought to have anti-inflammatory properties. So at one point, dementia physicians, and this is just before I started in this field, so more than a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago, people were putting everyone on mega doses of vitamin E. And then they did the studies, they looked at the epidemiology, and what's the outcome of putting people on presumably an anti-inflammatory, very safe medicine? Their dementia progressed quicker. So it's always, we have these very interesting associations and findings, but whether or not it's responsible and the right thing to do on an individual level, sadly, that requires even more efforts from clinical trialists and the like. And so I hope that maybe one day this paper, these results will launch those trials, but it's very unclear to me if any of those trials will be successful or beneficial.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to get going because we've got a support group, and there's some people there. Dr. Miller, thank you so much.
Yes.
You're amazing. And this will be posted up. And thank you again, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Dr. Miller.